They say a father's love has limits. But no one ever imagined we'd see the day a king, an actual king, looked at his own son and said, "We disown you." Let that sink in for a moment. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. What would drive a monarch, a man trained from birth to maintain composure, diplomacy, and unshakable public calm, to utter the four words every child fears hearing from a parent? We disown you. Imagine the weight of those words echoing inside Buckingham Palace, the murmurs, the panic, the stunned silence. Have you ever heard a room fall so quiet that even history seems to hold its breath? Because that's exactly what insiders say happened. Now, the question haunting millions across the world is simple. What pushed King Charles to this breaking point? And how did things spiral so quickly, so dramatically, so irreversibly? This story begins long before the announcement. Long before the press conferences, the palace leaks, the frantic tweets, the midnight phone calls, and the tremor that ran through the British monarchy like a fault line cracking open. But today, right now, the world is seeing the royal family reach a level of tension unseen in modern history. And the reason this matters, the reason everyone is talking about it, is because this isn't just about royal drama or tabloid gossip anymore. This is about legacy, bloodlines, trust, loyalty, betrayal, and the painful moment when a family's private fracture turns into a global spectacle. Ask yourself this. When was the last time the monarchy confronted a crisis so personal, so emotionally loaded, that even the palace staff found themselves whispering behind closed doors, too afraid to speak above a murmur? When was the last time we saw a future king reduced to trembling silence? When did the royal household, known for discipline, secrecy, and centuries of tradition, suddenly start admitting they no longer knew what Harry would do next? Because according to palace insiders, that's the situation we're walking into. And here's the part no one saw coming. The announcement wasn't planned for months. It wasn't a slow, methodical constitutional move. It wasn't the product of years of debate and paperwork. It was a reaction to something Prince Harry did or said in a moment that Buckingham Palace is still scrambling to control. Something so shocking that even longtime royal aides, the same people who survived Diana's scandals, the Queen's difficult years, and the infamous Megxit earthquake, realized, this time, the damage might be permanent. But before we get into the what, we need to understand the why. Because stories like this don't erupt out of nowhere. They simmer. They build. They accumulate pressure until the smallest spark becomes an explosion. And that spark, as one royal aide revealed, came from a place no one expected. Picture this. The king's study. Heavy drapes. The scent of old books and polished wood. Charles sitting behind his desk, papers scattered in front of him, glasses low on his nose, reading something so disturbing, so personal, that for the first time in years, he reportedly pushed his chair back and whispered, "Not again. Not him. Not now." Those around him knew that whisper wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. You know that kind of exhaustion, don't you? The kind you feel not in your muscles, but in your bones. The kind that comes not from one bad moment, but from hundreds of them stacking over time, pressing, weighing, crushing. That's the exhaustion King Charles felt reading the latest revelation about Harry. And here's another question for you, because this story demands questions. What kind of revelation forces a king to consider the most drastic action a father could ever take? Was it betrayal? Deception? A threat to the monarchy? A breach of trust? A hidden recording? A leaked document? A meeting with someone he shouldn't have met? Or was it something even bigger than that? By the time palace officials rushed into the room to check on him, the king was no longer whispering. He was pacing, breathing heavily. One hand gripping the edge of the desk, the other running through his hair as he muttered words no one had heard from him before, words that made staff freeze where they stood. It cannot continue. Not like this. Not anymore. Now imagine being one of those royal aides. You're standing there, watching the monarch, your boss, your sovereign, crumble under the weight of something that hasn't gone public yet. Something only a handful of people know. Something that, according to sources, threatened not only the image of the monarchy, but its stability. What would you do in that moment? Would you try to calm him? Offer support? Tell him it will blow over like everything else? They did all of that, and none of it worked. The king was done. And here's the part that shook the palace staff the hardest. Charles didn't ask for advice. He didn't ask for counsel. He didn't ask for protocol guidelines or legal boundaries. He made a decision. A decision that would change everything. But before he gave the order, before he instructed anyone to prepare the announcement, before he finalized the words that would soon blast across headlines worldwide, he made a phone call. A private one. A call that, according to those who overheard fragments of it, didn't sound like a king speaking to his son, but a man confronting someone he no longer recognized. Have you ever tried to talk to someone you love, only to realize halfway through the conversation that they're not the same person you once knew? That the voice is familiar, but the intent is gone? That the bond has thinned so much you can hear it snapping? That's what this phone call was. At one point, Charles reportedly said, "You leave me no choice." What did Harry say back? That part remains a mystery for now. But witnesses described the king's voice shifting, hardening, losing the softness only a parent has. Whatever Harry said, it wasn't an apology. And whatever he didn't say, made everything worse. Moments after the call ended, the king sat down again. His jaw was tight. His eyes were stinging, not with anger, but with something deeper, older, something rooted in years of disappointment. Then he wrote. He wrote the first draft of the announcement that would later send shockwaves through the world. People talk about royal press releases like they're ordinary pieces of paper. But this wasn't a regular document. This wasn't a statement about charity work or travel plans or a royal event. This was a declaration, a punishment, a line in the sand. And Charles wrote it by hand. What does that tell you? It tells you he wanted every word to count, every sentence to cut, every phrase to signal the end of something sacred. And while he was writing, the palace halls stirred with nervous energy. Staff exchanged glances. Whispers spread. Doors creaked open. Advisors began gathering. The atmosphere thickened with fear, not fear of danger, but fear of history being rewritten before their eyes. Because that's what was happening. History. And you're probably wondering, how did it get this bad? What pushed things over the edge? What mistake? What comment? What action finally crossed the line? That is the question everyone is asking. That is the question fueling every headline, every debate, every late-night discussion between royal watchers. And that is the question this story will answer, piece by piece. But here's the part you need to remember. This announcement wasn't just the product of one event. It was the explosion after years of pressure building. Years of interviews, memoirs, accusations, separations, distance, bitterness, accusations, and hurt. This is a story about a father pushed past his breaking point, a king forced to choose between his duty and his blood, and a prince whose actions finally came back to him in the most devastating way possible. So now here we are, the world watching, the monarchy trembling, social media in a frenzy, advisors panicking, and King Charles preparing to speak words that would sever something that was once unshakable. But before that announcement was made, something happened inside the palace that no one expected. A shift, a confrontation, a moment that would amplify everything and push the king into final, irreversible action. And what came next? It started with a sealed envelope, one the palace hoped would never be opened. Not by Charles, not by advisors, not by anyone with the authority to act on what was inside. Because some envelopes don't just contain paper. They contain consequences. And on that cold, gray morning in London, the envelope that landed on the king's polished mahogany desk didn't look like a threat. It was thin, unassuming, the kind of thing a secretary might drop off without a second thought. But when the king's private secretary stepped into his study, his face was too pale, too tense, too strained. He held the envelope like it might burn through his hand. Have you ever held something so small, a letter, an old photo, a screenshot, that still had the power to rearrange your entire world? That's what this envelope was. That's what it symbolized. The secretary didn't speak at first. He simply placed it down, took one step back, and waited. Charles didn't immediately pick it up. He stared at it, as if he already knew what was coming, as if he could feel the storm pressing against the paper. And that's when the first whispers started among the palace staff. Something was wrong. Something was brewing. Something had finally caught up with Prince Harry, and it wasn't going away this time. The king reached out, slowly, cautiously. His fingers hovered over it. Then he took a breath and opened it. The moment the paper slid out, everything changed. There are certain moments where you can feel history shift under your feet. This was one of them. The room seemed to shrink. The air tightened. Even the grandfather clock on the far wall sounded louder, its ticking slicing through the tension like a blade. Charles read the first sentence, then the second. By the third, his expression collapsed. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist. Those reactions would have been too simple, too human. Instead, the king went deadly still, the kind of stillness that terrified the aides who had worked with him for decades. They'd seen him tired. They'd seen him frustrated. They'd seen him pressured. But they had never seen him frozen. Not like this. Not with his eyes wide and unfocused. Not with his hand shaking just enough for the paper to tremble. So let's pause for a moment and ask the question you're undoubtedly thinking. What was in that envelope? Was it about money? A scandal? A betrayal? A legal threat? A recording? A document Harry signed without realizing the consequences? A leak exposing something the public wasn't meant to see? Or was it something worse? That's the thing. Everyone inside the palace knew it wasn't simple. Nothing involving Harry was simple anymore. It was always layered, messy, explosive. And this envelope was dynamite wrapped in stationery. The king's private secretary spoke first, his voice unsteady. "We received it through a confidential channel, sir." It was marked urgent. Charles didn't respond. He kept reading. His breathing changed. Shallow, rapid, controlled, but on the edge of breaking. The secretary tried again. "We believed it best that you saw it before anyone else." Still nothing. And that silence, that dreadful, heavy silence, triggered the panic. Because when a king is silent, the kingdom shakes. When Charles finally folded the letter, he didn't place it gently back on the desk. He pressed it down, slowly, deliberately, as if trying to keep something contained, as if the words themselves might leap off the page and set the palace on fire. Then he did something even more concerning. He stood up too quickly. His chair scraped harshly against the floor. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the courtyard below. You know that moment when anger hasn't turned to shouting yet, but it's pulsing beneath the skin like an electric current? That's what his posture radiated. He just stood there, staring, processing, breaking, and the secretary, unsure of what came next, remained frozen near the desk. Because what do you say to a king who looks like he's watching the last thread of his patience unravel? When Charles finally spoke, his voice was low, hoarse, weighted with years of exhaustion. "How long has this been known?" The secretary hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We were informed early this morning." "We," Charles repeated softly, hollowly, as if the word itself was an accusation. "Meaning others knew before I did." "Yes, sir." That was the first crack. Because since the beginning of this entire saga, the interviews, the memoir, the allegations, the blistering attacks, the public humiliations, the one complaint Charles kept buried deep inside was simple. He was always the last to know what his son had done. Even now, even after everything. He turned away from the window. "What else is in there?" The secretary swallowed. "There's more, sir." He held up another slip of paper from the envelope, smaller, handwritten, and far more personal. Charles took it, read it, and something in his face changed forever. His shoulders sagged. His jaw tightened. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with devastation. Because this wasn't just a political issue. This wasn't a PR disaster. This wasn't a misstep. This was personal, deeply personal, and it cut through him in a way nothing else had. Have you ever felt a betrayal so sharp you couldn't even name the feeling at first? Where it's not anger or sadness or shock alone, but a twisted combination of all three. That's what washed over the monarch. A tidal wave of disbelief and heartbreak. "What has he done?" Charles whispered. It wasn't a loud question. It wasn't a violent one. It was the kind of question a father asks when he finally realizes the child he raised is gone. Not literally, but emotionally, spiritually, in the ways that matter most. Then came the moment that shifted the trajectory of the entire monarchy. Charles placed the handwritten note on the desk. He pressed his hands flat against the wood. And he said, with a voice carved from grief, "It ends today." A simple sentence. 4 words. But those 4 words rolled through the palace like thunder. The secretary blinked. "Sir." Charles didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to, because the meaning was clear. The line had been crossed, and now there was no going back. Palace aides would later say they felt the temperature in the room drop, as if the monarchy itself sensed the gravity of the moment. Charles wasn't just reacting to the envelope. He was reacting to years of damage, insults, broken trust, and wounds that never healed. But here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because that envelope, the one that hit the king so hard, didn't arrive by accident. Someone wanted Charles to read it. Someone wanted him to react. Someone wanted the monarchy thrown into chaos. And the identity of that someone? Not revealed yet. That's where the tension began. Palace aides whispering, speculating, searching for the source. Was it a political source? A media insider? A former royal staff member? A foreign connection? An anonymous whistleblower? But the king wasn't focused on who sent it. He was focused on what it meant. And what it meant was catastrophic. He turned back to the secretary. "Summon the council," he said. Immediately. The words hit the room like a judge's gavel. Because when a king calls the council with that tone, it usually signals one thing. The monarchy is facing a crisis that requires drastic action. And Harry, whether he knew it or not, had triggered it. Minutes later, the king's private council began to gather. Advisors rushed through the hallways. Coattails swished. Shoes clicked sharply against marble floors. Eyes widened as rumors spread faster than the staff could walk. Something happened. Something bad. Something involving Harry. Something that forced the king to take action he had sworn to avoid for years. And inside that council chamber, the tension was suffocating. The king entered without ceremony, without pause, without even greeting the room. He placed the envelope at the center of the long table. "This," he said, "is the matter we must address." Every advisor leaned forward. Some inhaled sharply. Others exchanged horrified glances. The oldest member of the council whispered, "This crosses every boundary." Charles didn't disagree. Instead, he issued an order. "Prepare a formal response." "But, sir," one advisor stammered, "this would mean—" "I know what it means. Silence. Pure, unfiltered silence. The kind that suffocates." The council knew that if the king proceeded, the monarchy would cross a threshold unseen in modern times. A father disowning his son. A monarch severing ties with a prince. A global spectacle unlike anything the world has witnessed in decades. One young advisor, braver than the rest, finally asked, "Your Majesty, are you certain?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they weren't the eyes of a father anymore. They were the eyes of a king. "It is necessary." With those 3 words, centuries of royal tradition began to shake. And the council, realizing the severity of the situation, shifted from shock to action. Papers were pulled, tablets opened, phones silenced. They began drafting the preliminary structure of the announcement that would soon rock the world. But in the middle of that frantic planning, someone burst into the room. A breathless aide, face flushed, voice trembling with urgency. "Your Majesty, you need to see this immediately." Every head turned. Every hand froze. Every heartbeat quickened. And Charles, already pushed beyond his limit, stepped forward. "What now?" The aide hesitated. A hesitation so heavy it felt like another blow waiting to land. "There's been another development." Charles stiffened. The council looked around in confusion. Something else? Another crisis? Another revelation? Another betrayal? The aide swallowed. "It's about Prince Harry." And just like that, the tension in the room snapped. The king's jaw clenched. "What about him?" he asked, his voice lower, sharper, colder. The aide took a step back. "It's something you're not going to like." The king stared at him. And for the first time that morning, the first time since opening the envelope, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. What has he done now? But what the aide revealed next would make everything inside that envelope seem small by comparison. It wasn't just another scandal. It wasn't just another headline. It wasn't just another misstep. It was something so explosive, so damaging, so unthinkable, that the King's Council, all seasoned veterans of royal crisis, went ghost white at the news. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For the first time, insiders admitted the king was afraid. Not of scandal, not of politics, not of public backlash. He was afraid of his own son. Let that sink in. This wasn't about disapproval anymore. This wasn't about a father disappointed in his child's behavior. This was something darker. He was scared, because the moment that second message was delivered, The moment that breathless aide uttered the words, "It's about Prince Harry," the king's reaction wasn't confusion. It was dread. He didn't ask, "What did he do?" with curiosity. He asked it with fatigue, with foreboding, like a man who already knew he wasn't going to like the answer, like a man bracing himself for another stab from someone who once sat on his knee as a little boy. The aide held a tablet in his hands. Silent. Locked. Private. He hesitated. "Show me," Charles demanded. And that's when everything in the room changed. One video. 37 seconds. That's all it took. 37 seconds that would detonate every ounce of goodwill, every thread of patience, every strained attempt to preserve family loyalty. The screen lit up. The volume was low, but the imagery was clear. Too clear. The room fell still. No rustling papers. No nervous whispers. No coughs. Nothing but the soft hum of the tablet speaker. Prince Harry's face filled the screen. He was in a room, not royal, not secure. A hotel room, perhaps, dimly lit. A bottle of wine on the table beside him. He wasn't alone. The angle was tilted. The camera looked hidden, like it wasn't meant to be there. Then came the words. Words that can never be unsaid. Words that don't just burn bridges, they blow them to ash. "I should have taken them down when I had the chance. All of them." That was the first sentence. The second? "They deserve what's coming." And then, worst of all, laughter. Not casual laughter. Not harmless. But the kind of laugh that makes your blood run cold. Detached. Angry. Dangerous. One of the council members stood up. Another looked away. The youngest aide gasped under her breath. The king? He just stared. And stared. And stared. Because that wasn't the son he knew. That wasn't the boy he'd walked to school. The boy he'd wrapped his arms around at funerals. The boy he'd defended through thick and thin. That wasn't the Harry who cried in his arms the day they lost Diana. That wasn't the soldier. The advocate. The husband. That was someone else. Someone who no longer cared about the line between anger and destruction. And that was the moment Charles said what no one in the palace expected to hear. He wants to see it all fall. Let's pause right there. Because if a father says that, if a king says that, it isn't a political statement. It's a funeral for a relationship. And it was just getting started. The tablet was placed on the table. The video looped in silence. Over and over. Every time it played, the mood in the room changed a little more. From horror to shock. From shock to disbelief. From disbelief to quiet rage. The king sat down again. This time, slower. More deliberate. Like a man finally understanding just how far his son had fallen from grace. And how high the cost of denial had become. One advisor cleared his throat. "We don't know the context, Your Majesty. This could be edited. Does the context matter?" Charles snapped, sharper than anyone had ever heard. Silence. Another advisor, older, more careful, tried to reason. There are still paths to reconciliation. There may be explanations. Leverage, even. A chance to. "No," Charles said, eyes locked on the screen. "He's not asking for peace. He's preparing for war." And there it was. The line. The fracture. The final nail in a coffin sealed not by the press, not by advisors, but by Harry himself. And the question now facing the monarchy. The question no one dared speak aloud, was simple. How do you punish a prince who's already walked away? Do you strip his title? Take his name off official records? Block access to properties? Deny him funds? Erase him from succession? All of those were on the table. But one idea, darker than all the others, began to rise like smoke from the ashes of the council room. Disown him. Publicly. Permanently. You may be wondering, how does that even work? Can a king disown his own son? Is there a protocol? A clause in the royal bylaws? An ancient precedent? And the answer? There is, but it's never been used in modern times. Not since the days when kings ruled with iron fists and exile was a fate worse than death. But desperate times have a way of resurrecting desperate measures. The palace legal team was summoned immediately. No one was told why. No one dared ask. The king's orders were tight-lipped. Contained. Only 4 people knew the full truth. But whispers travel fast. And by the end of the afternoon, rumors were flying faster than aides could contain them. He's cutting Harry off. He's revoking everything. He's removing him from the family, from the firm, from history. And the most haunting rumor of all, he's going to say it on camera. That's when things really started to unravel. Because making a decision is one thing. Announcing it to the world is another. The press hadn't caught wind of it yet, not officially. But there were signs. Subtle changes in palace behavior. A sudden cancellation of Charles's public appearances. A closed-door, emergency meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Unusual activity around the communications office. Something was coming, and even the walls of Buckingham Palace felt it. In the middle of it all, Charles sat in solitude, the words from the video replaying in his mind. I should have taken them down when I had the chance. They deserve what's coming. And it haunted him, not just because it was cruel, but because somewhere deep down, he feared it was true. That his inaction had allowed all of this to fester. That his softness, his forgiveness, his hope that Harry would someday return to reason had only made it worse. This wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was a declaration of war. And war requires answers. Clear, swift, unyielding. But even as the king drafted his response, even as he instructed his press team to prepare for the hardest statement of his reign, there was one detail no one had noticed. The video? It had a timestamp. And that timestamp proved something chilling. The footage was recent. Very recent. As in, within the last 72 hours. Which meant Harry wasn't just spiraling in the past. He was spiraling now. Actively. Which raised another question. If this is what he's saying in private, what is he planning in public? And just as that question burned through the palace corridors, another call came in. This one from Los Angeles. From someone no one expected. A person with deep ties to Meghan. A person whose loyalty had always been unclear. But what they revealed would make the video look like a warm-up act. And what they said would send the king into the most difficult 24 hours of his reign. Because it wasn't just about words anymore. It was about actions. And those actions, once exposed, would make it impossible for the king to do anything but one thing. Make the announcement. The one that would echo across the globe. The one that would sever bloodlines in front of billions. The one that would begin with 4 devastating words. We disown you. But first, the king had to hear what was said on that second call. And what he heard would push him from heartbreak into fury. And it would leave no room for mercy. Because what came next would shatter the monarchy's last thread of hope, and no one saw it coming. Everyone gasped when Charles slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed across the council chamber. Sharp, startling, final. No one moved. No one breathed. Because when a king loses his composure, the room goes cold. And in that moment, the King of England wasn't a man in control. He was a father at the end of his rope. A father betrayed, cornered, humiliated. And the worst part? It wasn't the video. It wasn't even the words. It was the second call, the one that came from across the ocean, just as the council scrambled to recover from the footage they'd just watched. The call that made Charles's temper explode for the first time since his reign began. Let's rewind. Minutes earlier, as the king sat slumped in his chair, reeling from Harry's veiled threat, his personal secretary entered with a face so tight it looked carved from marble. "Sir," he said, carefully, "there's someone on the line. A woman. She says she knows what Harry's planning. And she insists it's worse than the video." The king didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the aide like he was asking the unspoken question. "Do I really want to know what comes next?" The aide gave a slow, subtle nod. And that was enough. Charles gestured to patch the call through. The speaker came alive with static. Then a breath. Then a voice. It was low. Anxious. "American. I don't have much time. But you need to hear this. Meghan has no idea I'm calling." Charles straightened, instantly alert. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated, then answered with a name that made 2 of the royal advisors in the room exchange alarmed glances. She wasn't just anyone. She had once been close to Meghan. Very close. In fact, she had been part of the early inner circle. The PR architects, the strategists, the ones who helped shape brand Sussex before the world even knew what it was. But something had changed. She wasn't loyal anymore. And now, she had a warning. "I've stayed quiet," she said. "But Harry, he's not in a good place. He's erratic. He's paranoid. He's talking to people he shouldn't be. Foreign connections. Private financiers. Content producers. Some of it's off the record. Some of it's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Charles asked, voice tight. She didn't sugarcoat it. "He's building a counter-narrative. Something massive. A series. Or a documentary. Or something worse. It's not just about exposing royal secrets anymore. He's rewriting history, and he's naming names. That's when Charles's hand came down on the table. Hard. The room jumped. This wasn't just another media circus. It wasn't another Oprah sit-down or another Ghostrian memoir. This was an operation. Strategic. Coordinated. Possibly even funded by outsiders with agendas that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with power. The king's voice dropped an octave. What does he have? The woman hesitated. Then came the list. Audio clips, photos, personal letters, an intercepted email chain, and, most damning of all, a recording of a private dinner conversation at Balmoral, recorded without consent. Allegedly. Charles froze. Because if that last part was true, if Harry had secretly recorded a royal family event, it would cross a legal, moral, and constitutional line so severe, it would require immediate retaliation. The aide mouthed one word to the other advisors in the room. Espionage. One of them, an older man, whispered back. DEFCON 1. Charles leaned over the table, hands trembling with fury. What does he plan to do with it? The caller sighed. Leak it, but not all at once. He wants to create waves. Release it in episodes. Like a weaponized series. Each week, a new bomb. Each clip timed for maximum damage. Charles stood up. The chair groaned behind him. His eyes were wide now. Not just with rage, but something more terrifying. Resolve. This ends now, he said. And when he said it this time, he meant it in the fullest, most unforgiving sense. No more hesitation. No more mercy. No more quiet tolerance of his son's behavior. The monarchy could survive scandal. It could survive divorce, separation, even rebellion. But it could not survive sabotage from within. Not like this. Not again. Not after everything they'd built to preserve the crown after Diana, after Andrew, after Megxit. Harry's behavior wasn't just personal betrayal anymore. It was an assault on the very foundation of the monarchy. And for that, there could be no pardon. Charles turned to his press chief. I want the announcement ready in 24 hours. We do it live. I speak directly. No scripts. No spin. The room protested. That's unprecedented, sir. It'll escalate the media storm. There will be backlash. Charles raised a hand. I don't care. One advisor, trying to salvage the moment, suggested a private intervention first. Perhaps we offer him a choice. Step back quietly. Renounce the titles voluntarily. No public shame. Charles shook his head. Would you negotiate with someone holding a match over a pile of your family's secrets? The room fell silent again. Because deep down, everyone knew. This was no longer a negotiation. This was damage control. And time was running out. But here's where things took yet another turn. Because just as the advisors began mapping out the logistics of a public address, a junior aide entered the room carrying a folder marked urgent. The king turned, visibly annoyed. What now? The aide looked terrified. He handed the folder to the press secretary, whispering in his ear. The secretary read the contents. His face turned white. Then he turned to Charles. It's worse than we thought. Charles's lips thinned. What do you mean? The secretary read aloud. An international distributor has already purchased preliminary rights to Harry's footage. It's been trademarked under a project called The Crown Lies. That was the title. The Crown Lies. 3 words. But they carried the weight of treason. Charles closed his eyes. Exhaled through his nose. Tightly. Controlled. Boiling. Then he opened them again and spoke with the clarity of a man who had finally made peace with the consequences of what he was about to do. Then I'll show him what truth really looks like. That was it. The moment the palace stopped playing defense. The moment the king chose the nuclear option. Because Harry hadn't just broken trust. He had weaponized it. And now, the only way to protect the crown was to cut him out. Entirely. Publicly. Permanently. One advisor whispered to another. Is he really going to disown him? The reply was chillingly calm. He already has. He's just waiting to say it out loud. And the next 24 hours? Would be the longest, most volatile countdown in royal history. The statement would need to be worded carefully. But not too carefully. The message had to be clear. The betrayal had to be addressed. The damage had to be acknowledged. And the son had to be removed from the equation. But before the statement could go live, there was one final twist. A move no one expected. A phone call. From Prince Harry himself. Not a public one. Not to the press. But directly to Charles. A desperate last-minute call that came just before midnight. when the king was alone in his chambers, reviewing the final wording of his speech. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He picked up, and the voice on the other end? Shaky, wounded, but not apologetic. "Dad?" Harry said. "You're making a mistake." Charles didn't respond. Not immediately. Because how do you respond when your son calls you the night before you erase him from the institution he was born into? How do you respond when everything inside you wants to scream, but you know you have to lead with dignity? How do you talk to someone who handed your family over to cameras, to interviews, to reality producers and content brokers? You don't. Not with words. Not anymore. Charles's voice was calm. Too calm. "You made the mistake, Harry. I'm just cleaning it up." And then, silence. Harry didn't hang up. Charles did. And just like that, everything was set in motion. The cameras were prepared. The palace press team was briefed. The embargo was placed on the royal website. The title of the speech was locked. And by morning, the world would hear it. The words, the statement, the decision. But as dawn broke over Buckingham Palace, with camera crews assembling outside and journalists scrambling for answers, one final leak, one final unauthorized leak, was about to drop online, and it would make everything 10 times worse. Because what surfaced next wasn't just words. It was proof. Proof that Harry had gone further than anyone realized. And what that proof showed would take this war from personal to historical, and no one, not even the king, was ready for it. The bigger problem came from California, a video clip no one was meant to see. But once it surfaced, there was no turning back. It wasn't supposed to leak. It wasn't even supposed to exist. Yet, like a grenade tossed into an already burning room, it detonated at the worst possible moment. Just hours before King Charles was set to make the most painful, history-altering announcement of his life. And the worst part? The leak didn't come from a stranger. It came from someone very close to Harry and Meghan, someone inside their inner circle, someone with access to private archives, someone who had had enough. Let's rewind to that morning. The palace was tense, silent. Every hallway buzzed with footsteps, but no one spoke above a whisper. Every staff member had been briefed. The press team was on standby. The speech was loaded and ready to broadcast. And then, without warning, the Royal Communications Director received a text. No words, just a link. It led to a Dropbox file. Password protected. The password? Frogmore fraud. Chilling. Inside, a video. Roughly 5 minutes. Poorly lit. Clearly shot on a hidden camera, but the audio? Crystal clear. The subject? Prince Harry. Again. But this time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't ranting about revenge or legacy. He was bragging, laughing, boasting to 2 unidentified individuals about how no one in the monarchy knows what's real anymore. And worse, how he had tested the boundaries for months to see how far he could go without being publicly cut off. I mean, think about it, Harry says in the clip, leaning back in a chair with a drink in his hand. I could fake a photo op with a stand-in kid, call it Archie, and they'd still have to say nothing. The room erupts in laughter. Someone off camera says, "No way, man. They'd never believe that." Harry smirks. They already did. Silence. You read that correctly. They already did. That single line stopped everyone in the palace cold. Because if what he said was even partially true, if Harry had knowingly manipulated the public with staged footage or misrepresented details about his family, then this was no longer just betrayal. It was deception on a national scale. Possibly international. Possibly criminal. The video went viral within hours. Uploaded first to an obscure European tabloid's YouTube channel, it exploded across platforms within minutes. Clips on X, threads on Reddit, explosive breakdowns on TikTok, reaction videos, hashtag campaigns, memes, speculation, hashtag Archie hoax trended worldwide. But inside Buckingham Palace, no one was laughing. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just about family shame anymore. This was about constitutional credibility. Because remember, royal children aren't just kids. They're symbols. They're potential heirs. They appear on official documents, historical records, foreign briefings. Their existence shapes diplomatic relationships. If there were any doubts, any fabrications, any falsified appearances, the monarchy would be rocked to its core. The king's communications director immediately stormed into Charles's study. "You need to see this now." The tablet was passed to Charles. The video played, and by the time it ended, his hands were shaking. But not from fear. From fury. He turned to his press secretary. No more waiting. We do it today. Move up the announcement. Sir. Now. The staff scattered. Calls were made. News outlets were updated. The emergency signal was sent to British television networks to prepare for a live broadcast within the hour. But here's what most people don't realize. Even then, even as the monarchy scrambled to react, there was one final debate happening behind closed doors. Not about whether to proceed. That had been decided. The question now was about how far Charles would go. Would he remove Harry's HRH title, already long debated, and partially dropped from public use? Would he cut all financial ties? Done. Would he remove him from the royal line of succession? Legally tricky, but possible. Or, and this is what chilled the room, would Charles do the unthinkable? Strip him of royal identity entirely? Disown him not just as a working royal, but as a Windsor? Because legally speaking, the king, under the Royal Marriages Act and his sovereign powers, has the ability to issue letters patent that redefine or revoke any title, name, or royal claim. It's rare, it's devastating, and it's permanent. One senior advisor reportedly asked, "Are we really ready to make Harry no one?" And Charles, without blinking, replied. He made that choice the moment he mocked this family. You see, to Charles, this wasn't about one video. It was about everything the video represented. The mockery, the callousness, the premeditated lies, the disrespect toward an institution that stood for 1,000 years, and a father who had bent over backwards to avoid public humiliation for his son. But it was also something deeper, something more primal. Harry had laughed about his own children, his own legacy, his own blood. And for a man like Charles, a man who was raised with the weight of tradition, legacy, and image, that wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration, the final straw, the final insult, the thing that turned quiet anger into decisive action. And so, the preparations began. The red velvet chair was positioned in the palace's formal blue drawing room. The royal crest was placed beside it. The camera crew was told not to adjust the lighting to soften the lines on the king's face. He wanted the world to see every wrinkle, every sleepless night, every ounce of pain. The speech, however, was not yet final, because as the king sat with his head in his hands, going over his draft, one last piece of information was placed on his desk. A sealed document, stamped confidential. Its contents? A legal notification from Parliamentary Council warning that if the king followed through with disowning Harry in full, not just removing titles, but stripping him of his family name and place in royal law, there would be pushback, constitutional friction, public division, possible legal challenge. In short, political fallout. Charles looked up slowly. I don't care. Because at this point, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about optics. It wasn't about public approval ratings or newspaper columns or BBC commentary. It was about protecting what was left, what remained, what still had honor, what still had truth. And that truth was this. Prince Harry, once the beloved spare, was now a liability so explosive he could bring down the whole monarchy if left unchecked. And so, at exactly 3:47 p.m., King Charles III gave the final order. All of it, he said. All of it goes. And just as the cameras began rolling, just as the palace press office hit send on the embargoed press release, just as the anchors across Britain were handed the breaking news alert, an anonymous user uploaded one final clip to a secured European server, a file titled crownleaks_part2_final.mov. And what it contained would make the previous leak look like child's play. Because this one involved another royal. A conversation. A plot. A betrayal buried for years. And it would change everything, again. But what that file revealed, we'll uncover in the next chapter. Because what comes next is the moment King Charles's personal revenge turns into a full-blown royal reckoning. And no one, not even Prince William, is safe. The king's private secretary rushed out the door, carrying history in his hands. Literally, because tucked beneath his arm was the final version of the royal statement. Not a speech, not a draft, but a seismic declaration, the kind that doesn't just change headlines, but rewrites royal history books. The kind that generations will study, debate, analyze. The kind that breaks bloodlines. And it was about to go live. But just as he disappeared down the polished corridor toward the palace broadcast suite, another staffer sprinted toward him, holding a phone, shouting breathlessly, "Stop! There's been another upload. Another leak. It's huge." The secretary skidded to a halt. Everyone in earshot turned. He took the phone, pressed play, and everything, the entire plan for the announcement, paused again. Because what played on the screen wasn't just Harry, it was Princess Beatrice. Yes, Princess Beatrice, the niece, the quiet one, the one who never made waves, the one who had carefully tiptoed around royal controversy like a seasoned chess player, avoiding scandal her entire life. Until now. The clip was short, barely a minute, but it was enough. Beatrice, seated across from Prince Harry in what appeared to be a private lounge, leaned forward and said, "They'll never believe you unless you detonate it all. You know that, right?" Harry nodded. Beatrice continued, "If you want real change, it has to burn first. Burn before it rebuilds." Then came the final line. "If I had the guts, I'd do it myself." The video cut off. But the implications? Devastating. Because this wasn't just Harry going rogue anymore. It wasn't just a rebellious son striking out against the monarchy. This was evidence, clear, visible, time-stamped, that there were sympathizers within the royal family, people who didn't just understand his motives. They agreed with them. And Princess Beatrice was one of them. The private secretary blinked twice, barely registering what he had just seen. Then he turned and sprinted back to the king's study, statement still under his arm. Plans now in disarray. Because how do you proceed with the most controversial royal statement of the century when you've just discovered that your son wasn't acting alone? Back in the blue drawing room, King Charles was being fitted with his lapel microphone. A makeup assistant was powdering his face, his hands trembling slightly. Aides stood along the walls, quiet, tense. The clock read 4:09 p.m. And then the door burst open. The secretary stormed in, the tablet in his hand. "Sir, we need to delay." Charles flinched. "What is it now?" The tablet was placed in his hands. The video cued. Beatrice's voice filled the room. And the moment the words played, "If I had the guts, I'd do it myself," Charles went pale. He removed the microphone slowly, quietly, like a man who'd just realized the war he was fighting was far bigger than he'd imagined. It wasn't just Harry anymore. It wasn't just California anymore. It was here, inside the palace. Inside the family, the betrayal had spread, and the question now became painfully clear. Who else knew? Who else shared Harry's mindset? Who else resented the system? Who else had secrets? Charles stood, his entire frame vibrating with rage. But more than that, confusion. He muttered something under his breath. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Beatrice, why? For a moment, no one knew what to say. Because what can you say when a seemingly loyal royal has just been caught on camera, encouraging a metaphorical arsonist to burn it all down? But then came the next twist. Because just as Charles was reeling from Beatrice's words, a second aide stepped in with a new file. Not digital. Printed. Confidential header stamped and read. "What now?" Charles asked, exhausted. The aide handed it over. "We've traced the leak." The room fell silent again. The Palace Tech team had been working behind the scenes since the first clip of Harry surfaced. Tracking IPs, monitoring shares, searching metadata, and they had found something. Someone had uploaded the video from a London IP. Not California, not France, not Germany, London, inside the UK. More specifically, Windsor Castle, one of the most secure locations in the entire country. And that revelation blew the lid off everything. Because now, Charles was facing not just rebellion, but infiltration. Someone inside the royal estate had recorded Harry and Beatrice. Someone had uploaded it strategically. Someone wanted it seen. But why? To embarrass Harry? To delay the king's statement? To force Charles into silence? Or worse, to incite a full royal war? That was the terrifying unknown. The clock was still ticking. The cameras were still rolling. But the king, just minutes away from delivering the most devastating speech of his life, had now been confronted with proof that multiple family members might be involved in the chaos. So he made a decision. He paused the broadcast, delayed the speech, and summoned his most trusted internal advisors. A war council of sorts. 3 people, the ones he trusted more than anyone else. One of them, Prince William. And when William entered the room, visibly shaken, Charles didn't greet him with a hug. He greeted him with a question. Did you know? William's eyes narrowed. About what? Charles tossed the tablet on the table. About Beatrice. About what she said. About Harry planning something deeper. William picked up the tablet, watched in silence. When it ended, he looked up. And what he said stunned the room. I warned her. Months ago, I told her he was dragging her into something that couldn't end well. Then why didn't you come to me? I thought she backed out. I didn't know it got this far. Charles clenched his fists. So now what? He asked. And that was the million-pound question. Because with every minute that passed, the public was growing more curious. News anchors whispered, why hasn't the announcement gone live? Twitter was exploding with theories. Leaks were spreading faster. And the monarchy was on the edge of its most public unraveling since 1936. But what Charles said next changed everything. We go forward. One of the advisors tried to stop him. Sir, with this new leak. I don't care. Charles's voice was lower now. Controlled. Measured. The more we wait, the more they control the story. We respond. Today. Now. And we say it all. Another aide asked. All of it, sir? Charles nodded. No redactions. No vague language. No safe phrases. We call this what it is. Betrayal. Subversion. Disgrace. And just as the room leaned into this final moment, this calm before the royal storm, Charles turned to William. I need you with me when I say it. William hesitated, but then nodded. I'll be there. The room cleared again. The speech was updated. The cameras reset. And this time, there would be no more delays. The world was about to hear from the king. But just before the countdown began, a palace guard approached with a small white envelope addressed in cursive handwriting. It was delivered anonymously. Hand-delivered. No postage. No tracking. The handwriting? Undeniably familiar. The name signed at the bottom? Meghan. And what was inside that letter would bring everything to a screeching halt again. Because what Meghan wrote wasn't an apology. It was a warning. And the moment Charles read it, he knew he had to make a decision. Not just as king, but as a man whose family and throne was hanging by a thread. And what came next would leave even William speechless. He wasn't supposed to be there, yet Harry appeared anyway. It was like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy. While King Charles stood behind a closed door preparing to deliver a historic statement that would sever royal ties with his son, Prince Harry, the very subject of that declaration, was silently being escorted through a side entrance of Buckingham Palace. No press, no warning, no protocol, just the echo of boots down polished corridors and the stunned looks of palace staff too afraid to speak. No one could have imagined it. After months of bitter estrangement, after lawsuits, leaks, accusations, mockery, betrayal, after publicly comparing his royal upbringing to a cage, after laughing about manipulating the public, after allegedly suggesting the monarchy should burn. He came back, but not to make peace, and certainly not to apologize. He came to confront his father before the words, "We disown you," left Charles's lips. And this time, there were no cameras, no scripted Netflix angles, no press handlers whispering over his shoulder, just father and son, and the tension between them, thicker than the palace walls. According to a senior aide, it was William who spotted him first. The heir to the throne was walking down the south corridor toward the press room when a flash of red caught his eye. Red laces on a pair of designer sneakers. Not exactly palace dress code. He turned and saw him. Harry, in a navy hoodie, wrinkled jeans, a look of exhaustion under his eyes. William stopped dead in his tracks. You shouldn't be here, he said. Harry raised an eyebrow. And yet here I am. The temperature dropped. Two brothers. Two futures. Two versions of the same story, colliding in the one place that could barely contain their past. William didn't move. Did you come to stop it? Harry shrugged. That depends. Is there anything left worth stopping? William stepped forward, slowly. I told Dad about Beatrice. Good, Harry replied. She deserves to be heard. She betrayed him. No, Harry said, voice flat. She told the truth. The air snapped between them like an invisible wire. Then, without another word, Harry walked past his brother, straight toward their father's private office. And as William watched him go, something in his chest twisted. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal, the drama, the public slander, for the briefest of moments, Harry looked like the boy who used to chase him through those same halls. The boy who once cried in his arms after losing their mother. The boy who used to call him Wills before there was a rift so wide no apology could reach across it. But that boy was gone now. What walked through that door wasn't a prince. It was a powder keg. Inside the study, Charles was standing by the fireplace, still gripping Meghan's letter in one hand. He didn't turn when Harry entered. He didn't speak. Neither did Harry. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in a room filled with so much unspoken history. Finally, Charles broke it. You should have called. Harry shrugged. You would have hung up. Charles didn't deny it. He simply handed over the letter. Harry read it, slowly, carefully, and when he looked up, there was something almost amused in his eyes. She still knows how to get under your skin, he said. Charles didn't rise to it. He just asked one question. Did you know about this letter? Harry's response. A soft, measured, defined no. And that's when it hit Charles. Not just the audacity, but the performance. Everything had become performance. Every glance, every statement, every leaked clip, every backchannel, every planted story, all of it choreographed for maximum effect. But this wasn't about Netflix anymore. This wasn't about revenge. It was about control. Because in that moment, Charles saw it clearly. Harry didn't come to reconcile. He came to reclaim power, or at least the illusion of it. A last-minute appearance. A personal confrontation. An emotional curveball just seconds before the king was set to go live. If Charles faltered now, if he hesitated, if he delayed the speech one more time, Harry would win. He would spin the delay as fear, frame it as weakness, claim victory in headlines across the globe. And Charles couldn't let that happen. Not anymore. So he did what no one expected. He told Harry to sit down. And then, with a voice colder than ice and sharper than steel, he read the final draft of the speech, out loud. Every word. Slowly. Painfully. Including the line that had shaken the entire royal council. Therefore, with great sorrow but greater clarity, I hereby remove all remaining titles, honors, and privileges from Prince Henry Charles Albert David, and acknowledge that he is, from this day forth, no longer a recognized representative of the crown. Harry didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, listening, arms crossed. When it was over, Charles folded the paper. Any response? He asked. Harry leaned back. And then he smiled. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't sad. It was strategic. You're doing this on live camera? He asked. Yes. Good, Harry said. Because so am I. Charles blinked. What? Harry stood, pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and said, Smile, Dad. You're already trending. Charles's eyes narrowed. The phone screen was glowing, recording the room. A live stream. Private. Possibly encrypted. But being watched. And just like that, the king realized the confrontation had been a setup. Not for resolution, but for footage. For content. Harry wasn't just crashing the announcement. He was producing his own. A counter-statement. A digital rebellion. Real-time. Live. Unfiltered. Before Charles could react, Harry turned and walked toward the door. And right before leaving, he said, History doesn't belong to the crown anymore, Dad. It belongs to whoever tells it best. Then he was gone. Vanished into the corridor. Security didn't stop him because no one had expected him to arrive. And as Charles stood alone in the silent room, staring at the doorway his son had just passed through, the weight of the moment came crashing down. He hadn't just lost Harry. He'd lost control of the narrative. Because now, there were two announcements. One from the throne, and one from the exile. And the race was on to see which would reach the world first. But before Charles could deliver his historic broadcast, Harry's feed went public, and what he said would send shockwaves through the monarchy all over again. Because this time, he had proof, and what he showed would ignite the greatest royal crisis in modern history.